Okay, I think we'll make a start, and there are a few others who'll be joining us over the course of the next few minutes. I'm Nicole Ferrie. I'm the Head of Media and Communications with the Centre for Nonviolence here in Bendigo. And I'm joined by my co-host, Robyn Trainor, who is the Senior Manager of Strategic Projects at CNV. We'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we walk and meet, the Jara people of the Dja Dja Wurrung, and we pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. A little bit of housekeeping before I introduce our amazing panellists today, some very incredible women who do some fabulous work on the front line and in prevention. Please keep yourself on mute. I think we've muted most of you as you come in, but if you're not on mute, please make sure that you stay that way. We're asking people to make comments or ask questions through the chat channel today, and Robyn will be monitoring those, and we'll ask questions throughout the course of the discussion. It's going to be a reasonably organic conversation. We'll start off with a couple of questions, and then we'll hear from the voices that matter most, and they are the experts who formed the Loddon Gender Equality and Violence Prevention Consortium. To many of you, they need no introduction, but to those of you who don't know who the incredible women on the screen are, we have Kate Wright. Actually, before we go ahead, if you can't see every face, just make sure you're on gallery view, which I've set as the host, but you might need to also do it on your screens. So we have Kate Wright, who is the CEO of Centre Against Sexual Assault Central Victoria. We have Tricia Currie, who is the CEO of Women's Health Loddon Mallee. We have Margaret. Hi, Tricia. We have Margaret McDonald, who is the CEO of Cobaw Community Health, or Sunbury and Cobaw Community Health now. We have Julie Oberin, who is the CEO of Annie North Women's Refuge. And we have Yvette Jaczina, who is Executive Manager of Programs and Services with Centre for Nonviolence. Welcome all of you, and thank you for joining us on the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women and the first of 16 Days of Activism. You are all incredible activists in your own right and have been so for decades. Julie, you in particular have been in this region for a very long time, working in the prevention of gender-based violence space, which is the work you have done has been significant. We might touch a little bit on COVID and ask you, is this a shadow pandemic?
Well, I've been saying it's never been a shadow pandemic. You know, it's been a pandemic for a very, very long time, and for as long as our history can see our past. And a couple of years ago, Natasha Stock-Despoja, who's the chair of our watch, was publicly talking about gender-based violence against women as being a pandemic. However, it's not a disease, it's social behaviour, it's structural. And COVID has been an incredible year that we really didn't see it coming like it came at us. And for at least violence against women to be now seen as a shadow pandemic, if that's what it takes to get people to take notice and for decision makers to do something about it, we'll live with it being called a shadow pandemic.
Thanks, Julie. Yvette, in terms of frontline services during COVID, what has been our experience?
So Annie North provides the Loddon region Family Violence After Hours service, which is a crisis after hours service. And our after hours referrals have significantly increased through the COVID-19 period. It's started a little bit slow, as we predicted that with any natural disaster and trauma and the lockdown, it was a little bit quiet, which we really worried about. But then we saw them coming for help. We had to get messages out there that the police would still respond. You know, refuges and family violence services and sexual assault services were still open and will see and support people. And sadly, they came. So, for example, in February, we had approximately 10 referrals a month, and by June that had doubled to 20 a month, and in September and October they were in the mid-20s a month, so it is still increasing. And I've been on other refuge meetings over the months, and it's increasing across the state. I was on a meeting this morning where the courts were talking about the police just being absolutely inundated, but also the courts themselves were receiving many more direct referrals that hadn't even been via the police. And they'd seen a massive increase of non-lethal strangulation, a massive increase of using kitchen utensils as weapons like kitchen knives and so forth. So a lot of change. You know, COVID didn't cause violence against women, but it certainly has had an impact on the way it plays out.
I can only agree. Oh, sorry, Yvette. We also, just talking about our after-hour service, is we've had a slightly different picture because we respond to sexual assault reports, and it can be within the family violence context or not. And we actually, during the lockdown periods, have seen a reduction in our crisis response. And then when the first lockdown eased, we had 5 crisis call-outs in 1 week, which is a lot for us. And then they've slowed down again in this second lockdown. But our normal referrals have increased. So there's something for us around crisis sexual assault in lockdown that we're not got our heads around yet, what's going on.
Yeah, it's been interesting to have a look at the numbers during the demand during the COVID period. For the Centre for Nonviolence has been the intake and crisis response for family violence in the Loddon region. We've had a steady, constant demand through the pandemic. However, we've seen spikes at the point where restrictions have eased. So when restrictions started to ease in June, we started to see spikes, and we were expecting that. We were expecting that when women were in a position to seek help, when they were able to leave their homes for a greater number of reasons, that they would do so. But we've also seen an increase in the risk and the complexity. One of the standout, well, a couple of some standout figures for us has been the women seeking crisis accommodation. We were provided with funding for crisis brokerage, and that funding has all been spent in the first quarter of this financial year. So that tells us a lot about where the demand is. And the other area that really stands out is the referrals to the risk assessment management panel. So that's the high risk panel, multi-agency high risk panel. And those referrals have increased. The risk is incredibly high. And I know that my colleagues on the panel could all attest to incredibly intense, long meetings, and that is a shift.
Yeah, further to that, Yvette, I was looking at some data that Safe Steps, which is a statewide contact point for people needing support around family violence, and their commentary was to the effect that, and very surprisingly to them, that their calls had risen, but the rise in calls was actually attributed to bystanders, to someone, not the woman herself, but someone around her, alerting Safe Steps to the fact that they were needing support to understand how they could support a woman who was experiencing family violence in lockdown.
Yeah, yes, and that is something that we have certainly seen an increase in contact from friends and family who have been really concerned. And the other significant spike has been with other services who do have the line of sight or the contact with the women and children particularly. So for example, services like maternal and child health or family services that are have been had more opportunity for that face-to-face contact. And so we've seen concerns raised by them, but also greater opportunities for collaboration as a result of that. So we might have been in the background, but supporting those services to support the victim.
And just to follow on from Yvette, so a little bit different to my colleagues today, as a community health service, and I could attest to the experiences of a number of community health services that I've been in touch with. But we know that almost every part of our service, and we deliver a whole range, so we're not a specialist service, we deliver a whole range of services across the community, and we now know that every one of those services have been touched across a whole age spectrum. And I think the other thing that I would like to add is that it is not just one age group of women. It is a whole range of age group of women, someone right into her, elderly years, that are reporting family violence. And that's a change of pattern. So whether you're talking about homelessness issues or child protection issues, or even families coming with children for allied health services, the incidents this year of family violence being reported, and as Yvette said, that increased risk and complexity, that has added an additional layer during the pandemic that staff have not witnessed before.
Yeah, I'd just like to add to that the children and young people that are living at home and experiencing sexual assault and abuse, we won't know the impact for them and the trauma they've experienced until we are in a more of a COVID normal, because their safety net was completely removed by not going to school, by not seeing the other agencies that they would see, and they were at home. We know that calls to Kids Helpline increased, and again, it was a bit of the bystander, what can I do for my friend? But I think we'll be seeing the impact of the trauma for young people for a very long time after this.
And it's probably a good segue into a conversation that Tricia, maybe you could talk to about the impact of disasters on women and children, and what we traditionally see, particularly after things like the bushfire, COVID. The impact on women in particular is significant.
Yeah, thanks, Nicole. It is significant, and we are seeing that in the emergent data. So I think, as my colleagues are saying here, some of that data will be still coming through for a good period of time ahead as people are adjusting to whatever the new COVID normal is. But you're absolutely right, Nicole, in terms of gender and disaster. The way in which we respond to disaster as a community is often absolutely influenced by a view of gender. So when we think about, the hero masculinity that's fighting a fire or disaster of some sort, it really is reinforcing very strongly a very binary stereotype that the men will be the rescuers and the women will be the carers and the nurturers. So that's taking, obviously. Taken to either extreme. There are many, other experiences in between, but it is very much reinforced through disaster that gender comes to play in terms of the expectations that are put upon women and put upon men. We've actually had a terrific session this morning, or at lunchtime today, with the Gender and Disaster pod that the Women's Health Services and Monash Uni have been developing over some period of time. So if anyone's interested, there's some great websites to click onto and get some more information. But what we do understand is that, when those very strong binary views of gender are applied in a disaster, it means that cracks really open up around the vulnerable. So certainly within the sense of male and female, but when we take what we call an intersectional view of what does gender mean in disaster, it means we need to start thinking about what is the messaging that's happening in that immediacy that occurs. And certainly through the GADPOD work, there's been evidence to the fact that, you know, the tyranny of urgency often increases inequality and will often reinstate the patriarchy. So we think about that construct. There are additional challenges that happen through disaster because of that. There's a little example I actually heard this morning that made me really stop and think when we think around what is gender, what is disaster, and just thinking around you know, that heterosexual view of male gender and how that also excludes those who are often in a minority because of their sexuality. So that sense of that all men will be the rescuers and and take on that role is quite excluding. And in terms of even thinking about, you know, relief centres and the way they're set up and being inclusive of all and not experiencing perhaps a sense of this is not a safe place if I'm not fitting a binary view of my gender. So there's a complexity to it. We're learning more as we go, and it's really important that we get an understanding of the impact of gender in the way in which that policy environment's developed around response to disaster, but also in the way in which we think about, you know, what are the resources that we have in our communities and not to limit them because of very rigid views of gender. So, you know, upon that, there's a lot of work that we're certainly involved with and with our partners across the region to really start to build up some good skills in understanding what gender and disaster is about.
I'd be interested to look at that that theory applied to this pandemic around the world of people returning to type and power being reclaimed by government, by our military and paramilitary organisations like police, the army, government, and traditional male-dominated workforces. Because in our sector, we have already seen a little bit of that in some of the decisions made that have impacted on our victim survivors in seeking services. So I think it's it has a very broad application.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it, Kate? Because to get through the emergency, you know, that sort of line of command is actually the way in which we respond to emergency, and we can get a bit stuck in it. And I think even if we look around at the moment, you know, I guess many of these systems are a bit stuck in it, and we need to be able to really nudge those systems into an equitable, not going back to what we were. We actually need a future that's much more equitable for women, for children, for safety, for gender equity, you know, for participation in the economy and participation in community. We've certainly seen a state budget come down yesterday that looks like it's a pretty big invitation for some investment into that, but also prepared to say I'm waiting to read the detail in budget paper number 3 to make sure that the dollars actually follow some of the intention around the work that can happen in that preventive manner by restructuring many things in our community to ensure that there's a real respect for women's participation in our communities.
And I'd like to pick up that point too, Tricia, and just in answering basically Karen's comment in the chat around some of the differences that we are seeing. So that how do we ensure gender equity? One of the things that we know in our experience is that we have increasing numbers of women over 55 who are homeless. They are homeless because of family violence. So that housing package is a great way to start that, but we need to make sure that access is equitable. I think also when Tricia's talking about system-wide changes, so the Family Violence Royal Commission, which has been a fantastic way to begin some system redesign in Victoria, still we need some investment in prevention. So I still think there is some leading work that Victoria can do. What does investment in family violence prevention look like? And that is more than just a behavioural response. It's more than a bystander response. It's more than housing provision for women who may be escaping from family violence. There's a whole range of things that I don't think we've even touched on around fundamental equality and how we actually use the social determinants of health to actually do a long-term permanent shift around family violence.
Yeah, just following on from that, Margaret, in terms of the Royal Commission, you know, absolutely the recommendations around a huge investment needed in the response and care for women and children and you know, others who've experienced family violence. We're seeing that it's probably still not enough. That's how big that need is, although it's certainly rolling out. But I will comment in terms of that primary prevention investment. Respect Victoria actually have noted that primary prevention prior to yesterday was about 3% of the total health budget, when in fact optimally it needs to be 12% for us to actually really be able to get some of this structural change and critical mass in attitudes to be addressed. So we're on a journey. We're still early days, I think. There's a lot to do.
We're on a journey. Sorry, do you want to go, Julie?
Just going to say something more about older women. One of the other phenomena that Safe Steps have experienced during COVID-19 was the impact of young people moving home because they've lost work. Universities have gone virtual. They can't afford to be in a share house anymore. So they've moved home, and there's been a lot of elder abuse. And the other real issue that we need to remember, and this is going back to those structural things that we've been talking about here, is the older women have experienced gender-based violence across their whole life, you know, often as children, as daughters, as wives, and as grandmothers. So the impact of that, and you know, we've seen what this has actually been called a tsunami of over 55 women coming for a long time who are just going to be homeless because of the violence, the impact on their physical and mental health, lack of superannuation, lack of work, all of those things. So a complete gap in income and wealth.
Absolutely, Julie. So it's more than the pay gap, isn't it? It's actually, it is that really deep impact. And we did see that. You mentioned superannuation. We know, well, actually many younger women have pretty much emptied out their superannuation, and particularly many younger women who've been in that gig economy where you haven't got the security of laying down, you know, decent superannuation. And I know that there are some things in the budget which will look to address that, and we really welcome them. But let's follow that young woman through her life cycle, and if she's exposed to family violence, to gender-based violence, in the way in which we are seeing right across our communities, there is no community exempt from this, then she will, it's not just the pay gap that we're concerned about, it's actually about her access to the wealth of our communities and not just our economy, the wealth of our communities in many ways. That means as an older woman, absolutely facing there's a very real risk of homelessness. And I know Margaret's been talking about this. I don't just mean talking about it, has been noting the data for some years in terms of older women and the prospect that they have on retirement. And the pandemic, as you're saying, Julie, has absolutely exacerbated it. Really precarious circumstances.
And so in terms of today being the International Day of Elimination against Violence Against Women and 16 Days of Activism, it seems that this year in particular, our voices need to be very loud. There is gender inequality everywhere we turn. The theme for Victoria this year is respect women, call it out. What are the consequences if we don't do that? And how should people do that?
For me, working in the Centre Against Sexual Assault, and there's 17 organisations that are funded to respond to sexual assault. For me, what I want to call out is the rates of sexual violence that occur both within family violence and outside of the family violence context. And I think there has been a huge investment in family violence response. Prevention, has been funded at higher rates than it ever has, but sexual assault is still very silent throughout most government documents. I think in the rolling action plan from Premier and Cabinet for family violence, sexual assault is mentioned once. In the Royal Commission, sexual assault, I think, gets 3 recommendations. And I think as a specialist agency, it needs to be more explicit. And for me, the 16 Days of Activism is about calling out the impact of sexual violence, the trauma it causes children and young people. And in addition to all of the economic impacts around loss of super, if you're an older woman or a younger woman living with trauma, trying to find employment or housing with a trauma background that's often represents itself as mental illness, it's really difficult. So for me, that's part of my call it out, and acknowledgement that it is also part of both a family violence and external to family violence issue.
And I would like to add to Kate, my call it out is that the impact on children and young people, particularly in witnessing or being a victim of family violence, that pervades in many cases the life trajectories of those children and young people. And I think we need to be calling out the true cost of family violence for the lifelong prospects for so many children and young people that have their schooling interrupted, that have so many aspects of their lives potentially interrupted. And without that, and again, contributes to mental health issues that we see across community health and other services. And so that investment in mental health that the government is currently adding to, I think is a part of that. But we actually need to attribute and look at the level that family violence causes in trauma and its ongoing impacts for children and young people and women, of course.
How damaging is it for us when we are trying to engage the community in conversations around changing attitudes towards women and children, when we have people like Donald Trump in power, or refusing to give up his power and his views towards women, and we see that also at a local level in Australia? How much have we still got to do to educate communities about what's ahead of us?
What an interesting question, Nicole. The behaviour you walk past is the behaviour you accept, and we've been seeing this at a global level. The lack of respect, it's extraordinary, and to such a degree, and of course in such a powerful position. We're speaking about, leader of the free world, or it used to be the case. But what happens when you see so-called role models or people in power stepping up and abusing their power in that way? It gives permission for others to do it. Others who aren't global leaders, but they might be, community leader, or they might be an employer, or a family member. So the ability to continue with those misogynistic behaviours gives permission for other people to walk past it too. That's why it's a huge concern, and we've got a big ship to turn around because of that sort of culture, so that it makes a space for misogynistic views and opinions and behaviours to become normalised, and we must not accept that. We must call it out.
As an organisation that works with men who use violence with their families, who choose to use violence with their families, I think about the group of staff, taking this down to the service delivery level, the group of staff who are working with those men when they've got, shall we say, role models in leadership roles that are telling them that their behaviour is not something to be called out, that their behaviour is acceptable and should be and can be celebrated. So we see it at the individual level and what the impact is and the resistance that we face as a result of that.
And while we're speaking about some of those behaviours, we've got a question about coercive control and an inquiry about the panellists' thoughts on the push to criminalise that in Australia. We might go to you, Julie, and ask your thoughts on that.
I'm actually working on a national discussion paper on this issue at the moment, and because there's quite a division of thought about it across the country, there's no real division in there's no division in the existence of coercive control as a really important element of gender-based violence, and that the potentially lethal consequence of it. The division in thought is around how best to respond to it and when is it right to respond to it, and is criminalising it the right thing to do, or should there be many other systems responses in place first or instead. There's a whole range of concerns about police not being ready yet to properly identify it. The criminal law as it stands isn't really capable of collecting a whole range or a whole pattern of so-called minor incidents, which to some people may not be or appear dangerous, but to others it could be. For example, a woman comes home and finds that her dishes have been done, in which, he's leaving her a complete message that he can get to her at any time he likes. That's really hard to criminalise. If you criminalise it, it has to be beyond doubt. There's different standards of evidence required, and it's really complicated about how to actually collect coercive control evidence. Like, we see very clear examples in hindsight, about where if you had known about this coercive control, you could have seen that coming. But hindsight's not good enough. We've got to get the whole system prepared to be able to do it. And there may be other ways of dealing with it. Victoria's already got laws which can address coercive control. Other states don't. Tasmania has criminalised it. We know that in England and Wales, the legislation's not that good. There's been very little take-up of it, very little prosecution. There's Scotland did a little bit better, and Ireland's having a go now. The evidence really isn't there yet about which works best and how we need to do it and how we need to train and support all of our frontline sectors, including police and courts. There has been no real consultation with victim survivors about this. And we know that there's real concerns out there about it being particularly discriminatory towards certain marginalised groups of women who have told us that it would inhibit them reporting. So, there's a whole lot of things to think about, and hopefully this discussion paper will lay some things out so that we can get a really good grasp of the common ground that we're working towards and what the concerns are, which will hopefully show us the way forward, because we really do need to address this as a national issue, not just have different responses from across different borders.
I think most of us are looking forward to reading that discussion paper, Julie. It also talks to what I think is a lack of understanding from the general community, even though there's been efforts over many decades from the grassroots feminist sector to educate about the drivers of violence and what violence looks like. There seems to be very much a misunderstanding around violence is only physical, coercive control is misunderstood. Perhaps someone could talk to what the drivers are and what violence looks like.
That's a lot. Oh, go ahead, Yvette. I'll go after you.
Well, what I was going to say, and I will pass over to you to talk about the drivers, Tricia, but one of the things that was going to say is that there are there's a real challenge with understanding within the community about what family violence is, but also within the system, parts of the system that respond to it. And I know that the staff at Centre for Nonviolence are advocating all of the time for the recognition of the risks that women and children are facing due to other forms of violence, including coercive control, that is minimised or brushed off, and people are looking for the physical incidents and those with evidence to be before they're able to recognise risk, and that's something that we really we need to change in the system, and that is happening. Some of that is happening. We are seeing some greater capacity across the system as services and are being expected to have a common language and understanding around risk, but it is a journey.
Yes, thanks for that, Yvette. In terms of, referring back to the Our Watch national framework that changed the story is it's the touchstone for this work. It's the evidence that we draw upon when we're thinking about, well, how do you prevent it? And we know that those drivers, we've spoken about a number of them already, that condoning of violence against women, it's, as I said before, it's thinking it's not my business, or it's private, or, they seem to have got away with it. There's nothing I can do. The coercive nature of, men's control over decision making is another of those. And the decision making, it really limits a woman's independence. That's what that coercive control is about in so many ways. We've referred already and reflected in this conversation on those stereotypes, those really rigid stereotypes. They sit at the base of this gendered violence. And the big one, which perhaps speaks to the theme that we've got for our 16 days, and that's disrespect. It's disrespect towards women, towards women's opinions and achievements, capabilities. And it's also the disrespect that's shown to men who, in fact, are prepared to challenge those stereotypes. So, the disrespect that actually emphasises men's aggressive behaviour. We see that in so many ways. There's some great work going on actually in terms of the preventative work, in working with the advertising industry around this work, the things that we see and are exposed to just so often through advertising, to really move away from these stereotypes that really don't speak to a lot of people in our communities. And we need to be making sure that when we call it out, we're calling it out because it's based in disrespect.
I think really good points, Tricia, and I think the overwhelming or underpinning element is also power. And there's a sense of power that's attributed to, previously Nick referred to Donald Trump, and we look at what happened in Australian Parliament recently with men and their behaviours that were both consensual, but it was power that was being displayed. And I think until we can address the perception that achieving gender equality doesn't mean for anyone losing power, we won't get anywhere, because there is too much of an investment in the systems that control most of our decision making to give it up. And I think people have been talking about advertising and the inappropriate images and the way women are used to advertise things for years. But until legislation are changed and standards are applied, people still are able to slip through, the net and still have inappropriate images. We've been talking about this now for, 35, 40 years. So I think there needs to be sort of a greater emphasis on controls.
Yeah, thanks, Kate. And I think the other, there are many parts to this, aren't there? Because, at the same time, we need to be really promoting women. you know, in leadership into decision-making roles, and enough women that we're actually, you know, that there's critical mass about it, not just one woman at a time, and you know, waiting until it's a big mess and then putting a woman into a position. We need to be really, you know, not just calling out men's control unless you're saying the power, but we need to be empowering women to be in a position where they, you know, have these the tools and resources at hand to be part of the decision making that we need to change. So it's no one single thing. Calling it out is about a whole range of actions, and you know, I guess that's where it's so fabulous, having a campaign like the 16 days where we can not just talk about it and describe it, but we can start to design actions to take to prevent it before it happens as well.
Can I just add too that we need to be really mindful about the gendered impact that COVID-19 has had on women. More women have suffered from loss of income, loss of jobs than men. It's had a greater impact because of the industries that closed down, which were traditionally female dominated, and the recovery investment packages are male dominated. So, you know, infrastructure, building. So again, jobs for men and less women in employment and with income. So it's going to increase the wealth and pay gap. It also reinforces gender stereotypes and goes back to that whole power of, you know, male breadwinner who's down the road building a house and his partner's lost a job. So those things have a real impact on individuals, families and communities.
They do, Julie, yeah. And we might have noticed in the budget yesterday, there will be an investment in supporting women to get into the construction industry, because that's where lots of the jobs will be. And I think what we'd all be wanting to see that's added to it, it's not just about opening the door for women to step into that industry, it's about making that industry safe for women to be employed in. So the next part of the work needs to happen. It's not just about the job, it's about a job that's actually safe. And I mean that in terms of, you know, let's think about the things we've been talking about here. You know, it's the at the bottom of that sort of, you know, pyramid of violence against women, we start with, you know, sexist jokes and misogyny in conversations. We start with biases in promotion, acknowledgement of skills and capability. I sat recently with a gorgeous young woman. She was 15 years of age and was enrolling in a mechanical engineering sort of unit in her learning, hands-on sort of stuff. She was really excited to be doing it. But in that conversation, she said to me, she said, I just wish I didn't have to ask every time to use the machines. So there she is. Yep, you know, it looks good on paper. We've got, you know, girls doing the, you know, the less traditional vocational work. But within that work, there needs to be restructuring within that, so that the gender bias is actually called out, seen, and something is done to change it. So yeah. Same thing as you're saying with jobs in the construction industry.
Yeah. Policing, for example, has been traditionally male dominated, but we've had women in policing for many, many, many years, and yet there's still current research coming out about the sexual harassment and abuse coming in the police force. You know, so it needs to be in by design right from the start.
Yeah, absolutely. Because what we suffer from, we could say the same. You know, local government. It's a very patriarchal system, and we have, you know, many magnificent women who stepped up to take on that leadership role in their communities, and the system itself, it's a really tough environment for women to be in. And so, you know, I think I'd like to, as part of the 16 days, to acknowledge the courage and the contribution so many women are making already to what leadership can look like. But without the structural changes, it's still a really tough gig.
It's the structural, and the gender, because, you know, if we look at the hospital system, the teaching system, the childcare system, it's all women dominated. But then if you go back to gender stereotypes, it's looking at the mental load. So of having a woman working full time and then potentially carrying the full load for her family as well. And that's what we also saw in this pandemic, is that we had women doing frontline work and trying to manage children at home and lockdown as well. And I think that goes right back to a cultural change as well.
And I was going to add that I think this is actually a human rights issue. And for a long time, we've seen it as a human rights issue, but I think we need to call it out that this is a human rights issue that is impacting on potentially so many people in our communities. I would also like to add, we're about to embark on what we think is a groundbreaking project with the Central Victorian Primary Care Partnership, Masson Ranges Shire Council. We've been funded by Vic Health to do a healthy masculinities project. So we are really looking forward to, over a long period, understanding how we can address some of the community attitudes and shift the thinking around healthy masculinities and what that looks like. So the project has recently been renamed. So we're just embarking on the base level research around that project, but imagine that it would go on for 10 or 20 years. That's the length of time that we estimate needs to be dedicated to changing some of these behaviours, thoughts, and way we raise boys and girls. And as Tricia said before, and not see gender as that binary. Cobaw has a great history of working with our LGBTI communities, and they would also say to us that we need to think much differently about gender and how we construct the gendered nature of every aspect of our society.
I just wanted to add in too, we haven't discussed anything about technology facilitated abuse, and basically want to give a call out to WesNet. If you go to WesNet's website, there's an amazing amount of information and resources there for people to access. WesNet's just done its second national survey of technology facilitated abuse, and it's increased from the first survey 5 years ago. It's absolutely a universal tool of perpetrators, and it's just prevalent in almost all cases, and it's had such an impact on women who say it's just everywhere. It's worse than physical violence. It's because it's technology. He's just omnipotent. He's everywhere all the time. He knows where I am. He controls everything, and it just has such an psychological impact on women that it's just has devastating consequences. So this is one thing we need to, any way you can, support WesNet in trying to gain funding to continue the project where they train frontline services. They provide safe phones to victim survivors, and the work's been absolutely incredible. But not to forget how technology is so important for women and girls to connect with society, to be a part of a positive, functioning individual with full human rights, is to be connected digitally to the internet. And we don't want to give messages to women and girls to stay away from technology. We want them to be absolutely tech savvy. There's been a real gender divide in technology. That's why perpetrators so easily misuse it. And so we've just got to try and encourage girls to be as tech savvy as possible, and train men and boys that it's not okay and they can't keep getting away with misusing it like they do.
Oh, Julie, that's such a pertinent point, isn't it? Because that resistance and pushback that women and girls experience is to silence them. So we just must not allow that to happen when it's so important, as you're saying, that we're able to use those tools to raise and amplify the voice of women and girls in our society.
And we know, sorry,
Nick. No, you go, Margaret.
And we know that COVID has changed the way that women and girls can safely access support. that's a critical thing that we've had reported to us. And technology was critical to their access. And so they've been watched. And because the living conditions and working conditions have been changed for so many people, they at home this year, they didn't have that opportunity to use the technology to gain the support.
How important is it that we do draw on the lived experience of women and girls and children to inform decisions that are made going forward? We hear about, Tricia, the example you gave of the 15-year-old having to ask permission to access technology in the workplace or equipment in the workplace. We know women are experts when it comes to managing their own safety, or when it's trying to navigate being a voice at a table in a meeting. What emphasis do we need to put on the learning we can have from their experiences to be able to affect any sort of change?
It's a critical part of service design, policy design, that we hear the voices of women with lived experience. We need to understand their experience. And going back to the discussion about coercive control, we need to understand what the implications are of any changes and to consider the unintended consequences of any changes to service delivery, to police response, etc. We are a lot of our those in power are divorced from the lived experience and make incredible assumptions about it, and they can be quite patronising, paternalistic. And so we absolutely need to lift those voices and hear those voices.
We might just go to another question from one of the attendees. How might the panellists respond to how universal services, for example, schools, be used or provide a place for identification, change and response?
Just from our perspective, what we see at CASA CV is a huge amount of calls, or a large amount of calls from schools in particular, knowing how to respond to certain behaviours or disclosures. And I think if we could be working more constructively in a developmental way with schools to be better able to respond, it would mean we would be reducing trauma much earlier than we are now. And I think also linking in with the child protection system where necessary is really important. And at the moment, it's seen as quite a punitive action to take when you do make a report to child protection. And a lot of people who are tasked with doing a mandatory report are reluctant. And I think there's a lot of training and information that could occur with universal services around that, particularly for children. And that's an investment in prevention. It's an investment in having to work with people 20 years down the track when they're not working, when they do have mental health issues. And I think the system needs to recalibrate to investing in training and then support and development for the universal services right from the intake when they go into accepting a role.
Yeah, thanks, Kate. Lots of thinking to do into this one. Julie mentioned it before, during COVID, when schools weren't actually open, there was, what do we say, the online learning was happening, and home was where most kids were meant to be, except those, of course, who were considered to be vulnerable or with special needs. And even just the identification of that in itself can be really problematic around the decision making and all the rest of it around that vulnerability. But I think what that's demonstrated to us time and time again, that schools are universal places. They are part of the village surrounding the child, and the village being there for the women who need a safe place. So I think we have an obligation to actually work and support the school system in building those skills, as you were saying, Kate. This is complex work, and so complex work means that you need support in making those decisions, and then guiding and supporting the processes that are being developed. And perhaps I'd just like to sort of salute our Loddon Capacity Consortium in terms of the really deep work that's gone in with this particular group around integrated services, constantly looking for improved outcomes for women. And in doing that, I think there's been that concept of safe hands. So schools need to be part of that overall system, don't they? And other universal settings as well.
Also knowing where to make an appropriate referral to, because we absolutely need specialist responses, particularly around family violence risk. And we all know that leaving or thinking about leaving is the most dangerous time for women, and he can pick up when she's thinking about leaving. And so for specialist services understand that risk and can help manage that leaving more safely than perhaps without that support.
And Julie, I would like to amplify that the integrated service that Tricia's talked about is critical for us. We've got Centre for Non-Violent staff located in our service. They work absolutely integrated with our practitioners and clinicians. And so that's an example. And one day soon we'll have CASA Central Victoria co-located. So that co-location means that we've got that seamless. And if we are concerned, the specialist expert services are there on the ground working with our staff to give that best support.
I'm mindful of time, so Margaret's just flagged the specialist expert services, and given we have 5 very key players here, if we could maybe just hear from each of you very quickly on your key message during the 16 days of activism before we finish today's session. I recognise I've just put you all on the spot, by the way.
I'll start, Nick. For me, it is about actually calling it out and recognising that the impacts of family violence are broader than we think, and it impacts the lives of children, young people and women and some men throughout their lives. It is a matter of human rights.
I'll add to what Margaret said, and for me, the 16 days of activism is a spotlight on gendered violence, and I think it's a fabulous spotlight, and I encourage the community to engage with this spotlight, but then not let it fade for the rest of the year, because it's not going away.
And I'll go next. I absolutely agree with all that. I think the hardest thing is to stop focusing on physical violence and bruises and black eyes and the label domestic and family violence for our sector. We have to really understand coercive control and power imbalances and how women modify their behaviour, and notice those changes. Like, one of the things I heard recently from a magistrate was that there were more women coming directly to court rather than going to the police, because she said they were like you and me. They were professionals, they may be working in the family violence field, they may be social workers. During COVID, it happened to them, and they didn't want the police to be involved, so they came to court for a protection remedy. So she said she saw a lot more of that happen. We also need to be really mindful and keep an eye on the children. Like, the children were so much more vulnerable, as Kate said, during COVID lockdown, particularly ones as well who the parents were separated and he had access to them, and the women were going to court and to counsellors completely distraught because he was using COVID-19 as another threat to say he would harm them, because she didn't know who he was seeing, where he was going with those children, and those children were caught up in all of this. So never to take the eyes off the children either.
Thanks for that, Julie. And I think that the 16 days of activism isn't opportunity for the community to start to learn and understand family violence, and as Kate says, not to keep the spotlight on it. This is a time of a spotlight, but not to just drop it after this period. Everyone in our community has a role to play, understanding the drivers of family violence and calling out behaviour that is harmful, even if it doesn't look harmful. Behaviours that are disrespectful and sexist and misogynist are harmful, and they embed this pandemic of violence in our community.
Thanks, and perhaps I'll say today's the first day of the 16 days where we're focusing on the elimination of gendered violence, and the 16th day will be the 10th of December, which is, as Margaret's referred to, Human Rights Day. So as Human Rights Day concludes at Women's Health Loddon Mallee, where our specialisation is the upstream of the prevention work as well, we'll be launching a regional strategy for collective action for respect and equality. So our invitation at the end of the 16 days will be for you to be active and collective in the work you're doing, so that we can make a difference together across the region. So looking forward to us being able to really describe the things that we can do that make a difference in those actions. So thanks, Nicole.
Thanks, everyone. It's been a really great conversation. I think most of us could sit here and chat for probably another hour or so, but I'm mindful that we do need to go. Thank you. And to everyone who's watching, thanks for joining us, and we hope to do more of these in the future. See you.
Thanks, Nicole and Robyn.
Yeah, thanks very much
you.
for organising.
Thanks, everyone.